Okay, good evening, everyone. This is time to begin our 10th lesson from church history, and hopefully that you're staying warm up here in cool Heath, Texas, or Texas, wherever you may be, North Texas. Or if you're watching online, then you know that you're staying warm because we had kind of a brisk, cool day today. So this is our 10th lesson, then this will be the last one of the year. So just real quick, like to run through the things. I'll do our statement first, what I like to do, a little something, take a detour on announcements. And statement is from the Latin word stare, which means to stand, and mentum meaning mind. Literally to stand your mind or state your opinion, if you will. And so that's what a statement really means, is to stand your mind if you were taking it very literal. As usual, you can contact me in any of these directions. If you want to have a statement or a question, you can get a hold of Jesse live. He's monitoring that. And there's his number on that. If you're recorded, you can email the comment or put it in the Church Center app. And I was even got one on Facebook Messenger this last week, which we'll kind of hit on. And we can kind of go from there. And then our Church Center app has some resources that I put on there. There's another one that I will add after this lesson in the next couple of days. Now, our next lesson will be next year, January 4th. So we're going to take time off for the holidays and not try to get mixed up with all that. Actually, we were going to have a lesson next week, but we got preempted by our church Christmas party. So if you're with us, it wasn't announced this morning, but we do have a church Christmas party at our house next week. And it starts at, you come and help me. Does anybody know what time it starts? We didn't have an announcement, so we don't know what time it starts, but we do know it's going to start next Sunday here at our house. Look for more information on that to come. All right, heard on the street. One of my favorite parts of doing this, a few things comments from the last lesson, which has been a couple of weeks. Perrin Music made a comment that I heard about, and she said, "I'm not too sure Ken's lessons and turkey are a good combination." That's probably meant unless you have insomnia, and then they work great. So anyway, so that was a comment that I'd heard that she made. And so Perrin, yes, definitely things word of mouth get travel, so be careful what you say. All right. And then at James Black, 1289, fact checked me during the last lesson, and he commented that the University of Constantinople was established in 425. And I think I had just said it was established like 423 or something. I made a comment like that. And then I will tell James that he didn't spell university. It should be capitalized. Ben Stevens said this: he could never be a monk because there's no joy in that lifestyle. And I think I would agree with Ben. I would have a very difficult time being a monk, and mainly because I like to sleep. All right. And then cat music, you can't leave cat out on these things. He made a comment. He says, "Do you prefer basted eggs on eggs Benedict," or something to that effect? Because we talked about Saint Benedict last time. See, I just lost. I'm getting puzzled looks on here because we talked about Saint Benedict last time, and I think he said something about, is that with that? So, you know, for that cat, you should give the book back, you know, because we can tell it's going to not be taken seriously. No. And then Nate Gilmore sent me a picture of this T-shirt, and this just showing you that history has an impact in the broader world. And so this was a great T-shirt, and if you want to buy me a Christmas gift, I would take it in an extra large, just so you'll know. And it is this, has a picture of St. Nicholas on there, and it says, "I came to give presents and punch heretics," and I'm all out of presents. So love that, Nate. Thank you for sending that over to me. I'll look for the gift sometime later in a couple of weeks. So what's on the docket for tonight? So we're going to do a little bit of our history review, church history, to kind of set the table again. And then we're going to talk about something called the Acacian Schism. And until I really started researching this and kind of getting into this lesson, I'd never heard of that. And that's what you can find from this. And there's certain things that happen on this that I think were just hilarious, and it's stuff that you cannot make up. And then we're going to end tonight with talking about Gregory the Great. So we'll save that for there. So that's kind of what's on tap tonight. So as we look at this thing, words of the week. Let's start out with Gus Gnosis. And the first word is pseudepigrapha. And pseudepigrapha is a rather long, complicated word. It comes from the Greek pseudes, meaning false, and epigraphe, which means writing. So it's a false writing. It's what a pseudepigrapha would mean. And we'll see that a little bit later in the lesson. And then the other word that I ran across is mongos. All right, I wanted to say mongoose, but it's mongos. And that's another Greek word describing a person who stammers. And my apologies for those of you that might have speech impediments, because I'm not a nice guy, and I think sometimes that can be rather funny. So that's our words of the week. We'll kind of get through that. So the Middle Ages map in about 500. Now this will start looking a little bit more familiar to you. Now what you'll see on this map as you look at this thing is I want to start over in the east, and you see Persia way over there in the green. It actually could have been called the Sassanid Empire as well. And that's what you'll hear a lot of. If you're talking about Byzantine, they will refer to that as the Sassanid Empire. We call it Persia. That has Persian roots and some much other things there, modern day Iran, Iraq, that area of the thing. And then you have Rome, and that's that pink area. It runs all the way, modern day Turkey, all the way down into the Levant, which is the area with Jerusalem, and that area is called the Levant. It actually is off the map, northern Africa. I'd probably say eastern North Africa, where Egypt is, and that area, Alexandria is down there. That's all part of the Roman Empire. Now you look at that and say, well, Rome's not in that empire, and that's correct, but that's what they would call it. It's just like we say we're Americans, and you go someplace else and they'll talk about us being Americans, and the Canadians are Americans, and people from Central America are Americans, and by the way, people from Peru and Chile are Americans too. All right, but if you go anyplace else and you talk about Americans, they usually are talking about people from the United States. All right, so that's kind of what Romans would be in that sense. And then you see Italia there. All right, so you start seeing a different name come in there, and that has a good part of Greece and Croatia, modern day, in that area, and Italy, of course. And then you go over, you see the Burgundy. So you know where Burgundy wine region is. That's going to be that area. North of that is the Franci. Okay, that's where the Franks are from. And then you go down here, it's Tolosa. All right, not a name that we would recognize. And then over way out there where modern day Portugal is, you see there. Still have Britannia and some other areas up here. Hibernia, all right, I think is the way it's pronounced, which is modern day Ireland. And then back off of this map, you would find the Picts, all right, P-I-C-T-S, and that would be the Scots. And then down on the other coast of Africa, you see the Mari, and this is going to be the Altava, and then the Vandals. And basically this area right here, the Vandals have taken that and basically ravaged that land. And that's where Augustine would have died, Hippo, Carthage, all that would be that area there. So that's just kind of a tour about what you would see. Some of the areas that are not colored that you might see is north of Rome is just off the map up there, not off the map, in the middle of the map is the Hunni, and then you're going to see some others in there that you may recognize as well too. The Langobardi, which are going to be eventually the Lombards, as we'll come into those as we run through this period. And so that's just a little bit of a tour around the Middle Age, early Middle Age, Western Europe, if you will. All right, so some of the rulers, and this is a little bit busy, and so we'll kind of walk through this thing. We're going to split this into West and East. And so West, you see some of these people, and you'll start recognizing these names in history. You got Clovis, who is the king of the Franks. He's a Merovingian, I believe is what it was. Theodoric is the king of Italy. We'll talk about him. And then Charlemagne is going to be over here. He was the first Holy Roman emperor. We're not going to get to him tonight. And then a little bit later is Otto the Great, who was also a Holy Roman emperor. By the way, none of them ever lived in Italy. So, and then you get to William the Conqueror, and that's going to be some of the things that we're looking down the road in the West, and you start recognizing some of those because we tend to spend more time in Western civilization than we do the East. But the East had plenty and plenty of stuff going on, all right? And in fact, through most of this period, the East is where the action happens. That's where the money is. That's where civilization still rules in the sense of Rome, and that's the Roman Empire, and so that's what's going on. Zeno is an emperor, and I mentioned that, and my youngest son said, oh, we're going to talk about Zeno the Barbarian or something, and it's somebody from a video game that I don't recognize and don't care to either. Justinian the Great is definitely a major player in this, and that's his picture down here. If you listen to the History of Byzantium podcast, this is their logo on this, is Justinian the Great, and there's lots of things we'll kind of probably glance off of him. During this time period, you see a little blue dot in there, and that's the birth of Muhammad. And so we're going to talk about Muhammad, but this is the time period where he was born, and next year we'll talk about him a little bit. And then another one of those, you can't make this up, is Irene. She was the first empress, all right, of the Roman Empire. And that's on the eastern side of things, and that's quite a story, all right? So I'll just leave you guessing on that. And then the picture down there is Otto the Great, which really belongs on the western side, but there'll be more that we'll cover and fill this in as we kind of move along. So that's just kind of a timeline of a little bit more of what's coming. Now I'm going to give you a different timeline next, and this is going to be Christian influencers is what I call this. And it actually goes back to 33 AD, or really even the birth of Christ. All right, and we're going to run through and just to show you, and this is just really more for a visual than anything else. On the top are some popes of note that we're going to talk about. Damasus, who I would kind of say was probably the first one that really started exercising pope kind of things, you know, where he's taken his influence and going over a much, much broader area. And if you recall, he was the one that basically got his thugs, his opposition, who was also elected as pope. He basically took them, put them in a church, and his thugs went in there and killed all of them. There was like 20 or 30 people that he killed, and that's how he became pope, and he became a very effective pope after that. So hopefully he changed his ways. Another one is Leo the Great. We talked about him in the last session a little bit. I'm going to leave him alone. Tonight we're going to talk about Felix the First, some, a little bit of a character, and then we're going to end again with Gregory the Great. And we'll fill these in as time goes on, because they are definitely part of what goes on in history, and they influence the church. And even Gregory the Great, I think tonight you'll see that we are influenced by so many things that he did. Now, writers of note. So this is writers, scholars, people that you know, like John Chrysostom, you're going to see down there. He really had more sermons. He didn't necessarily write as much, but these others definitely did. Justin Martyr, he was a writer. Tertullian, Origen, Anthony, who was the first monastic guy. So you see him in there. And then you see this people that we've covered over the last several sessions. Athanasius, Ambrose, Jerome, John Chrysostom, and Augustine. And then it starts getting thin. All right, look at this. From 300 to 1,000, you basically have just very few, and you probably haven't heard of many of these. Maybe you have, maybe you've not. Up until, what, Jesse, 4 years ago, I'd never heard of Boethius, all right? And yet he was one of the most influential persons, and we're going to have at least half a night that we'll spend on Boethius, because I think he is a fantastic story, and he's been called the last Roman emperor, and so or last Roman philosopher. Let me get the words right. There's another guy in here called Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, and he's kind of a mystic writer, and so he really writes on a lot of the mystic kind of stuff. We're not going to talk about him tonight. We may talk about him a little bit later. The reason he's called pseudo, if you remember that word from our Greek, it means false, and he's false Dionysius, all right? Dionysus. And so there was a character, or not a character, a person in the Bible that was with Paul. And so this pseudo-Dionysus, they were writing under his name, trying to imply that he wrote these letters with Paul, right after Paul. And so there are some things on that, but he gets into some very mystical things that we'll cover a little bit. Boniface was another one that you will see, and we'll talk about him when we get another couple of hundred years down the road. And then Bede, the one that I know about that is there's a term that's referred with Bede all the time. Do anybody know what it is in here? Venerable. The Venerable Bede is what they'll call him. And so that's Bede that will be in there. He does have some influence. And then you go all the way to Anselm in the year 1000. The reason this is called the Dark Ages a lot of time is because there's not much writing, especially on the Western Empire. And so when you get in here, you're going to find historically, you're going to find difficult things to really find out what's going on. A lot of times, the ones that were writing the story were really trying to make things go for somebody else. And so they're going to praise people, and they're going to have pseudepigrapha, all right, if we'll use that word, that's going to be, that will start to come into play more and more as we go through this part of the century. All right, so the first one, we're going to talk about the Acacian Schism, and I stole this from somebody else, and so you see the guy here talking about a heretic, so you can figure out what's going to go on. This lasted for a period of about, somebody do the math, 15, 19 is 34 years, something like that. This really is the first major division between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And it's all going to kind of come into play, and then it just fizzles out. So just to give you a spoiler alert. So let's look at it. So I want to take you back to the Council of Ephesus. And if you remember what the Council of Ephesus was about, that was the one where you have two parties. And I think I have these. Let me go back up. So let me just tell you. The Council of Ephesus, you had two parties. You had a group from Alexandria that had one position, and they show up. And then you had a group from Antioch, and they show up late. And they kind of get into a tiff, and they have all sorts of shenanigans and go on. Actually, I do have this. So Nestorius, who was the bishop of Constantinople at the time, he said, we really should call Mary Christo, I didn't spell it right, Christothokos, which means bearer of Christ, rather than Theotokos, which would mean bearer of God. All right? Now, that's a lot to fight about, right? Was she the bearer of Christ or the bearer of God? Now, if you say she's the bearer of Christ, then you imply that Christ isn't God. And that's where the rub starts. And so that's kind of where it all goes, and it gets a little bit crazy. So you had Antioch, John and Nestorius were from Antioch, or Nestorius was from, but they're on one side, and so that's kind of the Antiochene, and then the other is the Alexandrian. And that's Cyril of Alexandria led that, and kind of played hardball a little bit with this. So they had a lot of shenanigans with a little debate about the issue at hand. This was if you will, what am I saying, a kangaroo court just from the outset, because Cyril is saying, this is the way it's going to be, and you guys didn't show up, so guess what? We get to decide, and the questions are with. And they show up, and they go like, you can't tell us that, and so you start to see this division. And Alexandria would be on the western side of things, and you're going to see Antioch, who's a major, major church player at the time, is on the eastern side of things. So Emperor Theodosius, if you recall, he makes a decision on this, and he basically declares that both are correct. He arrests everybody and the leaders and puts them in jail for a period of time, I don't know, a few months or whatever, and then kind of lets them go and hopes the issue goes away. Sends them back on their way. Well, eventually John and Nestorius sign off on the creed, and they really are saying, I'm sorry, you were right and I was slightly less right. And that's about what they did, because this has not gone away. And they're going to continue, and basically Nestorius goes over to Antioch and points east, and so he's going to keep going east, and you'll get some more of that. So it's a debate about Christology. So they have another council, all right? So this is 431, and we're going to go about 20 years in the future because it's not lined out. And so they have a council of Chalcedon, all right? And Chalcedon was 451, and basically they're going to come out in the council, and they're going to decide the same thing that was decided at Ephesus, but they're endorsing it. And then they make this statement, and this is what they require everybody to sign off on it. And look at the wording on this. We all teach harmoniously that he, being Christ, is the same perfect in Godhead, the same perfect in manhood, truly God, truly man, and the same of a reasonable soul and body. The same essence or being, that's a homoousios is what they'll say, with the Father in Godhead, and the same essence with us in manhood. Same essence being with us in manhood. And so we're all agreeing that we acknowledge in two natures without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. Agreed? Good. Let's all go home. Obviously, that doesn't really answer this. By the way, this is the picture of Theodosius with the council, and you're going to see that's the picture there that we showed earlier, the mosaic that is in there. So you see him there with the bishops on his left hand, and then and a couple others there in there with him, and then you got the soldiers over here on the right, meaning we've got the power. All right, so we've got the power. So this is what Justinian. I'm sorry, I said Theodosius. So this is Justinian. All right, this is it. This is Christology made simple. All right, and I know this is a little chart, and it's very busy. So we can either go on, or I can just point out a couple of things. All right, Antiochian Christianity, Christology, and Alexandrian Christology. That's all you need to know. You can get down there, and there's lots of information. I will post this out there so you can look at it. It shows you all the people that are the sides. So way over here is Nestorius on the left. Way over on the right is Eutyches, all right? And you're going to see him, and he'll come up in a lot of debates. And that's where the monophysite, which that is not going to go away. And so basically you're going to see the Chalcedonian or the Chalcedonian contingent, and that's pretty much what was adopted and acclaimed. All right, so that's Christology made simple. So you got it all. There'll be a test later on. So keep talking about the Acacian Schism. It's a continuation of the Christological debate. Well, who was absent from that was Rome, right? So we don't have the Bishop of Rome. So if you, at that time, you would have had five major bishoprics, all right? Constantinople, Rome in the west, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. 4 of those are in the east. One's in the west. The west, really, this was never a debate going on in the west. They didn't even think about it. And when the word gets back to them that this happened, they were like, oh, okay. And they kind of move on, and they got other things that they're worrying about, because the Huns and the Goths, they're all coming down on their back door and breathing down their necks, so they're not really worried about a Christological debate. All right, but this does become the East-West Schism. So Pope Felix II, I think it's supposed to be, maybe it's third, anyway. Somebody can fact check me on that. He's the Pope in Rome, right? So we're going to call him the Pope because he's after Leo, and I'm going to call him popes from then on. He tells the Emperor Zeno, all right, he sends a message to him, and he says, you need to defend the faith. And by that, he means what was said at the Council of Chalcedon, all right? We all harmoniously agree that. And he's telling the Pope, or he's telling the Emperor, you can't let those guys get away with teaching that out there in the East. That's what he's doing. So you got a Pope telling the Emperor what to do. Let's see how that goes over. Well, so Acacius is the Patriarch of Constantinople at the time, all right? So another name there in there. And he prepares a document called the Henoticon, all right? Now, I don't have a copy of that, haven't read it, don't know what it means, but it was the Act of Union, and that's basically what the Henoticon was. And so Acacius, who is partial to the Antioch side, he's from the east, remember? So he's going to write this Act of Union, and he basically tries to compromise, if you will, on this. And so he's a little soft on what's going on in the east, right? So you get the idea of the debate, about that part of the debate. And so the emperor, being what emperors do, comes in and says, he makes it the law. So that's exactly what you're doing. You want to make church things the law. And he says, this is the law. What was said on the Henoticon was the law. And so the East likes it because it gives them a little leeway to do stuff. The West not so much, because you didn't do what the Pope said. So that's gonna come in a little bit. All right. So history that you can't make up. And I've got to try to do this with a straight face tonight, because I've tried this a couple of times and you do it. But this is history you can't make up. So Felix sends a summons to Acacius, and he says, you got to come to Rome. All right. And basically, we're going to hold a trial, and we're going to put you on trial. And this is one bishop putting another bishop, and they're all big boys, right? And we're going to put you on trial. So he sends a group of legates up to Constantinople to say, Acacius, you got to come with us. We're taking you to Rome. Now, how do you think that's going to go over? Not too well. So they were imprisoned, these legates, and they were forced to listen to mass and teaching by a guy named Peter Alexander III from Alexandria. Now, the thing is, think about this, they're going to listen to this guy teach, because he's going to teach them about monophysitism or Nestorianism or whatever you want to call it. that Antiochian view. This guy's got a nickname, and it's called Mongos, which means stutterer. Now, you can imagine this setup. He's sitting there going, you sinners, you got to come around to this way of thinking because otherwise you're going to go. And so you just hear this mass being conducted in this stuttering voice. And I'm thinking like, you can't make this stuff up. You know, I mean, first of all, who wants to sit through mass? It's almost as good as sitting through a church history class. And then if you get somebody that stutters as well, not a good combination. So that's what goes on. Well, so Mongos, he gets to teach them about this thing. So we'll move on about this. So keep going on this. Well, Felix then decides that he's going to depose and excommunicate Acacius. So now you got the bishop in Rome excommunicating the bishop in in Constantinople, because he did his legates. Well, Acacius, he's got a little power too, right? So he strikes Felix's name from the papal rolls. Says, you never were pope. You just mark you out here. You never were pope. All right. And so he's going to basically say that. And if you go to the Eastern Orthodox, I think they still don't count Felix as a bishop. All right. Still to this day. All right. Well, just to kind of get to the end of the story, these people are all going to die. All right. And they're going to get some bigger concerns that's going to come on. But they were entrenched, and that's the way it stood at that. And that was the first East-West schism. And so the others are going to have bigger problems than as I look at this Christology, and there's something there, but I'll tell you what, when you wade into that, it is a lot of hair splitting over words, and that's really what it is. And it was beyond me about why this was so important, but there were implications in there about the idea of who is Christ. And so, then there's some downstream implications of what you would believe about that. Well, the church eventually just drifted back to that Chalcedonian position, which is pretty much what Western Christianity still holds to today. In fact, the Church of the East, all right, and we came across this in our men's Bible study. We have a fellow in there that's an Indian, and so he goes back to India on mission trips and some things like that. And he said, yeah, you have the people that are the Church of the East or the Assyrian church. And we kind of scratched our head and said, I'm not familiar with who you're talking about. And he said, Nestorians. And they don't like to be called Nestorians. That's kind of offensive, all right? But that's what they are. They hold to this view. And you see that church, it's called the Church of the East, or you also have the Church of Assyria as well, too. And I think the Coptic church that Kathy and I went and visited a month or so ago may have the same view. Not 100% sure about that. Well, these seeds are planted, though, here for a further East-West issue. And so that'll come up during our time period, about another 500 years from now, that it's really going to come full in bloom. So that's the end. And cue up Warner Brothers. Okay, so that was the end of the Acacian Schism. But again, there are seeds that are planted there. All right, so the times are changing, right? And so we're getting into the medieval ages. You're going to see more pictures that are going to like that. And of course, I'm going to be in Western times, and we're going to talk about the Goths. All right, so those Goths. Now, so in the West, Odoacer, basically, he is the one that comes in and he becomes the king of Italy. And so there's still a Western emperor, all right? But this guy's name is Romulus Augustulus, all right? And I may not even spell that correct. So this guy is kind of a puppet emperor, all right? But he's still an emperor, and Odoacer finally just says, listen, why don't you go set out on an island someplace and just enjoy your end of your days? And the guy says, I'm okay with that, and he leaves. All right, so that's the end of it. That's the end of the Western Roman emperors. We have no more after this until you get to a Holy Roman Emperor, which is a whole different discussion. Well, Theodoric the Great, all right, is the guy you'll hear, he kind of forces Odoacer out now, and so they're having this kind of running civil war in Italy, and you got one group of Huns fighting another group of Huns, and Odoacer is kind of getting old, and he says, I'm kind of getting tired of this. All right, I'm just going to turn it all over to you. And so they kind of have a meeting and have a big banquet, and they come to terms on that. And so Theodoric thinks, oh, this is good, right? So the good thing here. And so Theodoric basically takes a sword and just cuts the guy in half. He starts at the top and goes to the bottom. And legend has it saying, I knew the guy didn't have a bone in his body. And that's how Theodoric becomes the new king of Italy. And by the way, known as Theodoric the Great. So if you're a common person or a clergy or whatever in Rome at the time, or nobility, you're divided. What do you do about this? The traditionalists and the nobility, they want the old way of life. They want to preserve that way of life. They want the old Roman Empire back. They'd really rather have an emperor because, that says that they're an empire. Now, the other people, the pragmatists and the commoners, the people that are out doing the work, they're going like, listen, if you take a thing about this, take a page from a very popular TV series, it's the Game of Thrones. We really don't have any interest in that. We don't care who's serving. We do the same thing all day long anyway. So they say, all hail King Theodoric, let's just move on with life. And so you kind of have this divide and this split among people, as you can see how that would go. Well, that's all kind of well and good until Pope Anastasius dies. He's Anastasius II. He dies in 498, and he would have been on the traditionalist and the nobility side of things. So they've lost their pope, all right? And so Pope Anastasius dies 498, and so who to pope now, right? Well, replacements, more than one, are elected and ordained on the same day. The first one is Laurentius. He's an old aristocracy money guy. And Symmachus, who is the clergy's man and the commoners people. All right, this is the one that they like. Well, how to settle this? Well, let's do mob violence first, right? Because we always know that works. And so then that kind of doesn't work. So let's let King Theodoric. And by the way, he's ruling from Ravenna, which is out on the eastern coast of Italy. And so Ravenna's out there. He's Arian theology. He's a Gothic culture. He's not, he comes from up in those Germanic places, and they're just a bunch of barbarians anyway. So that's kind of what he's got, but they let him decide this. And so he basically says Symmachus wins, all right? And then as a consolation, Laurentius gets the consolation prize of another bishopric in Rome. That makes sense, right? But you have a pope, and you have, guess who he's working for now? All right, well, that may not work. So immediately, the aristocracy begins this smear campaign, all right? And they start saying that Symmachus, they said, he's misappropriated church funds and assets. He's been fooling around with women. He's not celibate. And so Theodoric basically orders, remember the king now, he gets wind of this, and he orders him to be tried by a synod. All right, so how is that going to play out? Well, Symmachus says he refuses to participate. Cue up MC Hammer, can't touch this. And he basically comes out and says, a pope cannot be judged, listen to this, a pope cannot be judged by any court or man, civil or ecclesiastical. Got that? This is precedent to this day, that you can't judge the pope, civil or ecclesiastical. Once you're a pope, you're always a pope. And they are, if you will, above the law, so to speak. Now, that's not going to always hold true, but that is the position that is still held, that these guys are perfect and you can't be judged by that. So you go back to things happening today, all the way back around the year 500, all right? Well, a smear campaign continues on, and so he's starting to say things like he's using the old Roman calendar to determine what Easter is. Now, why that's an issue, I don't know. It's like, and how would he have known how to determine Easter and everything else? It's just a smear campaign that's going on. Well, Theodoric gets tired of this stuff, and so he says, I'm going to make another decision. We're going to do this. We're going to have two popes, right? Why not have two popes? All right, because they're just popes, right? A bishop, right? So we're just going to have two popes. How do you think that's going to work out? So Laurentius, he's the nobility's man, remember? And he's a wealthy aristocrat, and he makes him pope inside the city walls of Rome. And so he gets places like the Lateran Basilica and other church property like the Santa Maria Maggiore, all right, which still stands today, and it looks like that on the inside. These guys had money, all right, and this is in Rome still today, and it is supposed to be one of the most beautiful churches you can walk into. And so this is one of them, and this is the kind of stuff that he starts, and there's still stuff in there from his day and time. Now, I'm sure they've expanded and grew this thing, especially through the Renaissance time, but this is something that happens from these things. All right. Well, Symmachus, what does he get? Right? You might hear some of these things. So here he is, writing the letter of the law. He is called the Pope outside the city walls. And so they get some place called St. Peter's Basilica out on Mons Vaticanus. Those things sound familiar to you? We know where St. Peter's Basilica is, and it's in Vatican City today. Well, about that. But since he's had this smear campaign going on, and he's, by the way, cast outside the city walls, he's got an inferiority complex going on. But he does have one advantage, all right? They didn't have a printing press, but he knows how to spread fake news. And that's nothing new. And so he manufactures many proofs or pseudepigrapha of the powers of the Pope, specifically his powers. So let's see what some of those are. Some of these are that he goes back, and they had a lot of them about Pope Sylvester, all right? And there's some good reasons for this. Remember, Pope Sylvester would have been at the time of Constantine. And so he says Pope Sylvester is really the one that baptized Constantine, not Eusebius of Nicodemia, or if you remember who that guy was. He also says Pope Sylvester cured Constantine of leprosy. That didn't happen. He said that Constantine gave the Roman Pope supremacy over the Western Empire. By the way, civil and ecclesiastical. And so that's another one of the documents. So he's just printing these documents, not printing, but he's producing these documents coming out on these things. And the one that's probably very, very important is going to have a big place, a thing called the Donation of Constantine. It's this letter. You can go pick it up, and basically and by the way, they have pictures, right? These and other documents became foundation of church authority. And so just to prove it here, here's a mosaic of Constantine giving the Western Empire over to Pope Sylvester. All that does is basically say, yeah, the Pope has power. All right, now, all well and good, right? They're all fake. Well, they don't know they're fake. How do you go fact check in that day and time? And so that's what becomes a little bit of an issue. So about 100 years later on this, another guy comes along called Gregory. And by the way, Gregory buys into all this stuff, and there's some good reasons for that. And that's where we're going to end up tonight. We're going to finish talking about Pope Gregory the Great. And he is the Pope from 590 to 604. We'll talk a little bit more about his background. He is one of the three popes that has great after his name, the other being Leo I and Nicholas I. He is one of the four great Latin church fathers, along with Augustine, Jerome, and Ambrose. And so this is the fourth of that. So if you would, the Mount Rushmore of the great Latin church. If you want to take that kind of analogy. He's a doctor of the church, and I think there's around 30 or so doctors of the church. And John Calvin even called him the last good pope. And so he deserves the moniker the Great, and hopefully we'll see that as we go through this. All right. He was the most prolific writer. You saw that time frame. He was the most prolific writer during this time, and the Eastern Christianity will even call him Saint Gregory the Dialogist, all right, basically because he's producing dialogue and some other things. We have our calendar today. The 12 months of our calendar, they're from Gregory, all right? So if you want to know what day you're born on, you're referring to something that Gregory or Gregory's papacy produced. We have Gregorian chants, which, by the way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but Gregorian chants, they changed music, even to this day. He had a lot of missionary efforts. There's a story about him seeing these two little orphan kids that were maybe being sold into slavery, and they come up there and they just are angelic. And he says, "Where are you from?" And they say, "Britannia." And so he says, "Well, you're not Anglo, you're angels. And that prompted him basically to send another guy named Augustine to a place called Canterbury in Great Britain. So you start seeing the things that are going on during this time. And so that's one of the things. And so these orphans basically prompted him to send a missionary up to Great Britain. So if you have any English heritage, good chance that if you're a Christian and you have English heritage, that you can point back to these two little orphan kids there that basically the gospel goes to England or to Great Britain. So the early life and background of him, the city of Rome was in ruins, especially when he was growing up. The Visigoths had attacked with Alaric in 410. There was the first sacking in 800 years. It wasn't the last. About 45 years later, the Vandals come in, and that's where we get the term vandalism, wanton destruction of property. And if you look at the ruins back in the background, a lot of that was sacked because of these guys. The Ostrogoths come in 476, and they're basically going to take all the wealth out of the city. So there's no defenses, and by the way, there's getting no help from the Eastern Roman Empire at the time. It's like, no, you guys are on your own out there. And so they're back there doing this, and so you see this is going on. Well, if you're Gregory and you're born, kind of right after this, it's going to affect you. You've been in for lack of a better term, a war-torn world. And it's affected, and you see the great city that used to be. And you see all sorts of things like that. Well, he's born in 540, and so you see that. And his dad was a prominent Roman senator of the time, may have gone to Constantinople and other places, but he's still wealthy, and they're actually out away from Rome, and that'll come into play a little bit. He's educated in some of the classic things, grammar, rhetoric, law, and he became the prefect, or which we might call it the mayor of Rome in 570 at the age of 30. All right. And it's a mess. And that's basically where there's no aqueducts. There's all sorts of problems that are going on in Rome. And if they build anything back, guess what? Some Vandals or Goths or somebody's going to come in, the Lombards, they're going to come back in and take whatever you have built. So he is a Benedictine, all right? That's what he decides. He becomes a Benedictine monk because he preferred humble service, and this is a quote, he preferred humble service over personal prestige. He was not looking for the limelight. He decided to do this. So he actually converts his family estate into a monastery. And it was still to this day, it's called St. Andrew's Monastery, and it's in Italy. And we'll look at this thing. I couldn't find a picture on that, but he becomes a Benedictine monk. And so we go back to our last lesson, and we talk about the rule of St. Benedict. He was right in there, man. Waking up at midnight, 3 a.m., matins, prime, and you go through the whole thing, and they reciting scripture. But the other thing the Benedictines did was they served. They were part of their community, and they served. And you'll see that he became a papal ambassador during this time. And he actually challenged Eutychus of Constantinople in front of the Emperor Tiberius later on. So he actually presents, because he's got this law background, he's got a rhetoric background, and so he knows his stuff, and he knows about these things, and he actually gets to present this before the emperor. And so he challenged him in front of Tiberius II. He was elevated to Pope 590 AD. All right, and so this is kind of where he starts. He's going to kind of get out of the Benedictine monastery and start ruling more territory stuff. He was the great administrator. His background in the civil stuff is going to come into play. He tackled the issues of the city of Rome with the patrimony of St. Peter, is what he's called. He's taking church funds and church income, and he is tackling the issues in Rome. And they had sanitation issues. The water had been cut off. The garbage service isn't there. People are throwing filth out, trash out. Plague comes along. The economics are terrible. They're shambles. And if you know anything about Benedictine monasteries, they are very frugal with things. And so he's going to tackle the economic issues that they have. The infrastructure, he's going to rebuild the aqueducts and some of the bridges and some other things. Churches start getting built during his time. He ministers to the sick, and this is something that, man, they were brutal to people. you got sick, a lot of times you're out. Something's wrong with you. We're setting you outside the walls and everything else. And he provided aid for the poor. And so these are the things that he's implementing. Because the church basically had, if you look at these other cats, a lot of them were in it for themselves. And he is not. He really comes back in and he has that true Benedictine service attitude. If you listen to what Ben talked about, this guy had been a great example of that, of someone following that. The pure and undefiled religion before our God and Father is this, to care for the widows and orphans. He would preach that, but not just preach it, he would practice that. And so that's something to admire him for. He was also a great writer. This book over here on the right side of the screen is called the Liber Regulae Pastoralis. And I'll look at Logan and say, what does that mean? It means the pastoral rule. It's basically a book, guidelines for bishops, pastors, priests, spiritual leaders, whatever you want. And it really hammers on moral integrity, gentle correction, and standard teaching. So don't lose sight of what some of this stuff is, because it comes into place. Like when you start about standard teaching, then there's certain things that need to be taught. But it's coming in. It's that idea that discipline of Saint Benedict rule comes in, and he's implemented on the clergy, which have been, for a lot of them, a big change. He also wrote Moriala on Job, or in Job, which is basically, it's a commentary on the book of Job. He went in verse by verse on the commentary. Was one of the things, but he explored broader questions like human suffering, divine justice, and redemption. And so that's why you start seeing, when you've got difficult, hard times going in, the book of Job speaks to those. Why do bad things happen? And he addresses that. And so in his book on those are probably his two best known books that you would run through. And he was a student and an advocate of everything Augustine wrote. So Augustine speculates on purgatory. If you remember Confessions and Confessions, and maybe you don't remember, but Augustine is just obsessed with his sin. And he goes through all this stuff, and he speculates and says there should be a place after you die that you go to purge your sin. And that would be called purgatory. All right? And so he writes this kind of thing. And so that's what Augustine said, to get rid of that sin before you can go to heaven. Well, Gregory takes that and says, that's doctrine. So he accepts that and creates that doctrine. So how does Augustine affect Middle Age, even to today, theology? All right, through somebody like Gregory the Great. And so that's the part there. So he would take that over there. And so that's where you get the doctrine of purgatory. Now, when you get later on, as we move down, we'll see another guy named Dante that will take this to a whole different level. But he's taken the doctrine here, and he's going to create a whole bunch of new things in the Divine Comedies. So just a few things that Gregory did. The other thing that you have to remember is Gregory was pragmatic about everything. He wants to get the job done at all, basically, I want to say nearly at all cost. And so he spread the gospel by all means. And so he will allow people to adapt local beliefs to fit the gospel. And so when you have characters that would come along, whether it be a Norse god or something like that, he's going to say, well, that really isn't talking about, Odin isn't talking about this guy. He's really talking about God. And so he'll bring in things like that. And so you start getting a lot of kind of strange beliefs going on in some of the Christian areas under his rule. Music reforms, we talked about this, Gregorian chants. So why do, I just saw this, if you think about Gregorian chants, you hear certain things that go through your mind. And if I was real creative, I could have queued one up and listened to the thing. But they're not hard to find. Just ask your playlist to play a Gregorian chant, and you can find something. And by the way, there are some that are very beautiful that are coming out more recent times. But Gregorian chants have one thing in common a lot of times, is they repeat things. All right? How many times do we have a chorus that repeats what the verses say? That is from the Gregorian chants. All right? So even today, this morning, we had some stuff that go all the way back to Gregory the Great. He's the one that was the thinker and the reviser of those kind of things. Our calendar, we've already mentioned that we have a Gregorian calendar, and man, that's crazy when you think about that. He created the Gregorian liturgy. And again, we do a lot of things basically because of the Gregorian liturgy. And a liturgy is basically how you conduct your church service. What should you do? You should read scripture. You're going to hear a lesson. You're going to have communion, and he's going to have all that stuff laid out in that liturgy. And so a lot of that still comes into play today. He believed very strongly, and I love this, in the communal, this comes out of the Benedictine thing, the communal identity of believers should be based on worship in spirit and truth, not on what somebody else says to you. And that's really what he said. He did come back and say that, which that's not going to hold true all through the ages, but yet the Protestants will come back, and that's why John Calvin would say, this guy was pretty good. All right, if you're going to have a good pope, this is a guy you want. So that's the end of that story. And so now I'm done with this thing. So coming next year, all right, we're going to talk about these things. And I know I've got a few of them lined up. We're going to talk about the Eastern Church. So we've talked about the Western here in the Middle Ages. We're going to go to the Eastern Church. I'll probably get to talk about Irene during that lesson. Then I'll probably do one that's going to be at least half a night on Muhammad and Islam. It could take a full lesson. And it's not church history, but boy, does it impact church. All right. And then the last Roman philosopher, Boethius, and we're going to run into the Holy Roman Empire, which, if you heard the joke, there was nothing holy about it, there was nothing Roman about it, and there was never really an empire. And so that was really kind of a crazy thing. So if you have any questions, and Jesse, I don't know if you can check online. If people have questions, we'll hang on here for a couple of minutes, and otherwise we'll end early tonight. So nothing online, so hopefully people are watching. If not, they'll watch it later. And Kathy does have a question.
So there were 2 popes.
Yep.
And then you go to Gregory.
Yes.
So who did he replace, and how did that?
Okay, so her question is, there were 2 popes that I mentioned, and then I jumped over to Gregory, and yes, I did. I skipped a lot. Just to kind of wrap a bow around those 2 popes, basically the nobility guy, the money guy, he didn't do much of anything. The other guy, Symmachus, he actually did a lot. He did a lot of evangelism. He did a lot of church building. He did a lot of things that really solidified the Pope in St. Peter's Basilica and in the Vatican. And so that's really where that got started. The other guy, he just kind of got wealthy and just had an easy life inside. And they didn't last too much longer than that. And then there's going to be another guy come in and another guy come in. And basically the popes are going to decline during this period. To date, there have been something like 266 popes. And not many of them are worth talking about. When we get into another part of this time, I may see if I can't drag my book out about the bad popes. And there were 13, I think it was 13 popes that were just notorious, but we'll save that for another day. So does that answer the question enough? Those guys basically are going to continue on. Symmachus does some good things, solidifies that, and then they basically die, and then they move on. So, other questions?
With Gregory taking speculation floated by, Augustine speculates on this thing, and Gregory takes that and says, this is doctrine now. Is this when you start to see the Catholic Church taking extra biblical teachings as doctrine?
Okay, so his question is Gregory, taking everything Augustine does and things like that. It's not a point, but it's a process. This, because of what was going on here. I mean, if you're in the common person in the West right now, and you're saying, okay, who's taking care of me? Who's putting our water back in place? Who's building our bridges? Who's dealing with the Lombards when they come down? It's Gregory. He's doing all those things. He's doing everything that an emperor should be doing. All right, and he's doing it with such a great attitude that who are you going to love? You're going to love this guy. You don't love whoever the emperor is in Constantinople. That's not your emperor. This guy's your emperor. And you know, he deals with Theodoric, and he deals with other people. No, I don't think Theodoric would have been around then. He's going to deal with whoever the king of Italy is. But you start seeing this nation state and these other bishops from other places referring back to this guy. And he's such a good guy, you can't help but follow him. And so that's part of it. In terms of doctrine, he is, like Augustine is one of the ones he buys into. He also buys into that stuff that Felix was putting out, or Symmachus was putting out. You know, Symmachus was putting out all this false stuff. So Gregory's going to look at this donation to Constantine, which, by the way, donated the Western Empire, basically, but really specifically these papal states. And so you've maybe heard of papal states. That's basically the southern part of Italy today. And those belonged to the church. And the Pope ruled those as a secular ruler for centuries. And that's going to go all the way through the Middle Ages that you see that. And so it really establishes the authority of the Pope, and what he says and what the church says goes. You know, and Scripture at that time for the West would have been Jerome's Latin Vulgate. That's it. And so you can get into that. But the only ones that really had that Scripture might have been some church people. The common people did not have Scripture. One, because the printing. The other is most of them couldn't read, even at that time. I mean, education has gone like this in the West. And a lot of those people, like they say Charlemagne, they don't think Charlemagne could read. You know, that's one of the things that you look at. So he's the king. He can't read, but he can sure carry a sword. And by the way, his granddad was a guy called Charles Martel, which means the hammer. And he's the one that turned back Islam in France, basically. So, but that's a story for another night. So, any other questions about this? You got anything over there? Jonah, questions? Logan? Did I get my Latin correct, Logan?
So what about Pope Innocent? Is he?
Which one?
Yeah, the third.
We're not to him yet. Okay. So he asked about what about Pope Innocent III? And I like to call him Pope Not So Innocent III, because he's the one that you're going to see some of the Inquisition come into play under his reign. And that's again for later on in the Middle Ages. This is still early Middle Ages. You're trying to figure out who's really in charge. And Gregory the Great, through some of this stuff, puts the church in charge. All right, don't lose track of that. And some of it is, again, if you're going to follow a guy, you're in that day, you're going to do it. You're going to be like everybody else. It's like, man, this guy is doing great. You know, taking care of the poor. He's, you know, just everything he did, he did it well. So, and with a great spirit as well too. As a good guy, you know, I wish we had politicians that were like Gregory the Great. Not necessarily that I want them to run the church, but but at least administer like that. So, all right, if that's all, unless you got any other, one more time. Okay, if that's all, then we'll end tonight, and wish you guys all a Merry Christmas as we go through. So, bye.